Sir, this ID looks suspicious. I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify your credentials with security. You can't enter the National Museum of the United States Air Force without proper authorization. The words cut through the busy morning atmosphere at the visitor entrance to Wright Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, sharp enough to make several other visitors waiting to enter the museum complex pause and turn to look. Airman First Class Jake Morrison, 21 years old and 7 months into his first assignment working security at the main visitor center entrance to the museum, stood examining a military retiree identification card with exaggerated skepticism and the particular suspicion of someone who believed they had caught someone attempting to gain unauthorized access using fraudulent credentials. Before him stood an elderly man whose modest appearance and advanced age had triggered Morrison's doubt about the authenticity of his military service and his right to visit the Air Force Museum complex. The man was Colonel Robert Viper Harrison, USAF, retired, 78 years old, standing at 5 feet 11 inches with the upright military bearing that never quite leaves combat pilots even decades after their last flight. He wore simple civilian clothes that looked like they'd been purchased for comfort rather than impression. A plain button-down shirt in light blue, khaki pants that had been washed many times, comfortable walking shoes with worn soles, and a faded Air Force veteran baseball cap that showed significant age. His face showed the deep lines carved by 7 decades of life, including 32 months flying combat missions over North Vietnam, and his hands, though showing the slight tremor common to advanced age, bore the scars and calluses that come from decades of manipulating aircraft controls under combat stress. A small American flag lapel pin was his only visible indication of military service, and to Morrison's young and inexperienced eye, he looked exactly like the kind of person who might use a fake military ID to gain free access to museums and military facilities. Morrison held the ID card up to the light, examining it with theatrical authority. "Sir, this ID says you're a retired colonel, but you look pretty old to have been an officer. And this expiration date seems off. Plus, you're driving a car with special license plates that claim Medal of Honor recipient status, which seems suspicious for someone your age. I'm going to need to see additional documentation proving your identity and service record before I can allow you access to the museum." The accusation was delivered loudly enough that visitors in 3 adjacent entrance lanes could hear clearly, and the embarrassment factor was rising rapidly. Several other visitors exchanged uncomfortable glances, and one middle-aged man who appeared to be prior military himself tried to interject. "Son, maybe you should just check his credentials in the system rather than." "Sir, please stay out of this," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the aggressive authority of someone who believed he was preventing a security breach. "I'm trained to identify fraudulent credentials, and this ID shows multiple red flags that indicate possible forgery. I'm doing my job protecting this facility." Before Colonel Harrison could respond with what would likely have been patient explanation, a voice called out from the visitor center office with sharp authority that made every person in the entrance area stand slightly straighter. "Airman Morrison, step away from that entrance lane right now and report to my office immediately. That's a direct order." The speaker was Colonel Sarah Chen, 48 years old, the director of the National Museum of the United States Air Force and herself a command pilot with 26 years of Air Force service including combat time in Iraq and Afghanistan. She had been reviewing the day's visitor schedule when she happened to glance at the security camera monitors and recognized Colonel Harrison immediately, both from his legendary status in Air Force aviation history and from having met him personally at multiple Air Force events over her career. She had seen Morrison's confrontational body language on the security feed and immediately recognized that her young airman had just made a catastrophic error that needed to be corrected before it caused serious damage to the museum's relationship with the veteran community. Morrison's confident expression finally cracked as he realized a senior officer had witnessed his entire interaction and sounded profoundly displeased. He walked toward the office with diminishing swagger, aware that every visitor in the entrance area was now watching him and sensing that perhaps he had badly misjudged the situation. Colonel Chen waited until Morrison was inside her office before speaking, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of a commander who was containing genuine anger through sheer force of professional discipline. "Airman Morrison, do you have any idea who you just accused of using fraudulent credentials?" Morrison straightened defensively. Ma'am, he's an elderly civilian with an ID that shows irregularities and special license plates that claim Medal of Honor status. I was trained to watch for stolen valor and fraudulent credentials. I was just doing my job protecting the facility from, that man, Chen interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade, is Colonel Robert Harrison, call sign Viper. He flew F-4 Phantom II aircraft with the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing out of Yuban Royal Thai Air Force Base during the Vietnam War. He completed 287 combat missions over North Vietnam between 1967 and 1970. On April 19, 1968, he was shot down over North Vietnam, spent 6 days evading capture in hostile territory, and was eventually rescued in what became one of the most famous combat search and rescue operations of the war. Chen pulled up her computer and rapidly navigated to several official Air Force websites, turning the screen so Morrison could see clearly. The first site was the official Air Force Medal of Honor recipients database, showing Colonel Harrison's name, photograph from his younger days, and a detailed citation describing his actions. The second site was the Air Force Historical Research Agency archive showing his complete service record spanning from 1964 to 1996, 32 years of distinguished service. The third site was a video from a recent Air Force ceremony where Harrison had been a guest speaker at the Air Force Academy. Colonel Harrison, Chen continued, her voice growing harder with each sentence, received the Medal of Honor for his actions on March 23, 1968, when his flight lead was shot down over North Vietnam. Despite his own aircraft being heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire, Colonel Harrison remained over the crash site for over 40 minutes under intense ground fire, directing rescue helicopters to the downed pilot's location and providing defensive fire that allowed the rescue to succeed. He took multiple hits to his aircraft, nearly ran out of fuel, and had to make an emergency landing at a forward airstrip with his F-4 barely controllable. His actions saved his wingman's life and represented the highest traditions of Air Force combat aviation. She pulled up another document showing Harrison's complete service record. After his combat tour, Colonel Harrison served as an instructor pilot at the Fighter Weapons School, commanded 2 different fighter squadrons, served as vice wing commander at Nellis Air Force Base, and retired in 1996 as a full colonel with over 4,000 flight hours in fighter aircraft. That suspicious ID you questioned is a legitimate retired military identification card issued by the Defense Enrollment Eligibility Reporting System. The off-expiration date you noticed is actually a special designation for Medal of Honor recipients whose credentials never expire. The license plates you called suspicious are official Medal of Honor recipient plates issued by the state of Ohio and are among the most legitimate special plates available. Morrison's face had transitioned from defensive to pale as the magnitude of his error became clear. He stared at the computer screen showing Colonel Harrison's distinguished service record, trying to reconcile his image of the man as a suspicious elderly civilian with the reality of one of the Air Force's most decorated combat pilots. Chen wasn't finished with his education. The reason Colonel Harrison looks pretty old to have been an officer is because he's 78 years old and has been retired for 28 years. The reason he dresses in simple civilian clothes rather than wearing his medals and uniform is because that's what humble professionals do, they don't need to broadcast their service to feel validated. The reason he was visiting the museum today is because he's scheduled to speak to a group of Air Force Academy cadets about combat aviation history and the traditions of Air Force fighter operations. Instead of that educational experience, those cadets are going to hear about how an Air Force security airman publicly accused one of their most distinguished heroes of stolen valor and fraud. She pulled up the day's event schedule showing Harrison's 10 a.m. speaking engagement with 50 Air Force Academy cadets. This museum exists to honor and preserve Air Force history and to educate current and future airmen about the service and sacrifice of those who came before. You just humiliated one of the most significant figures in that history and prevented him from fulfilling an educational mission that would have inspired the next generation of Air Force officers. The fraudulent credentials you were protecting the facility from are actually more legitimate than any credentials you or I will ever possess. Chen turned her computer screen to show news articles and historical documentation. Colonel Harrison is mentioned in multiple Air Force history books about Vietnam air operations. He's been the subject of magazine articles, documentary films, and historical research about combat aviation. The rescue operation that earned him the Medal of Honor is taught as a case study at the Air Force Weapons School and the Fighter Weapons Instructor course. Pilots who fly today use tactics and procedures that were refined by officers like Colonel Harrison based on their combat experience. You didn't just insult an individual, you insulted a living piece of Air Force heritage. Morrison managed to find his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I didn't know." He looked like an ordinary old man, and the ID seemed unusual. "I was taught to watch for stolen valor cases where people fake military service. I thought I was protecting the facility and honoring real veterans by preventing fraud." "You were assuming fraud based on appearance and age," Chen corrected sharply, and instead of respectfully verifying credentials through the proper system, which would have immediately confirmed his identity, you made public accusations that humiliated a genuine American hero. The training you received about stolen valor was meant to help you identify actual fraud, not to give you license to question every elderly veteran whose appearance doesn't match your expectations." She gestured toward the entrance area where Colonel Harrison waited patiently, having seen this kind of mistake before and understanding that young service members sometimes lacked the experience to recognize what real veterans looked like. Stolen valor is a real problem, and it's right to be vigilant. But there's a difference between careful verification and aggressive accusation. You could have quietly run his ID through the system, which would have shown his Medal of Honor recipient status and his scheduled speaking engagement. Instead, you chose public confrontation based on your personal judgment that he looked too old and suspicious. Chen stood and gestured toward the door. "You're going to go out there and personally apologize to Colonel Harrison in front of everyone who witnessed your accusation. You're going to escort him personally to the auditorium where he's speaking to cadets. And you're going to attend that presentation so you can learn what actual Air Force service and sacrifice look like. This is going to be a learning experience about respect, humility, and the reality that heroes don't always look like movie characters with chest full of medals and dramatic bearing. Sometimes they look like your grandfather." Morrison returned to the entrance area with his confidence completely shattered, finding Colonel Harrison standing calmly beside the security desk, having used the time to chat pleasantly with other visitors and answer questions from a young boy about what it was like to fly fighter jets. The elderly colonel showed no anger or impatience, just the patient demeanor of someone who had faced more serious challenges than being temporarily delayed at a museum entrance. "Colonel Harrison, sir," Morrison began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you a profound apology. I was completely wrong. I questioned your credentials and accused you of fraud based on my inexperience and poor judgment. I disrespected you publicly when you deserved nothing but honor and gratitude. I'm truly sorry, sir." Harrison looked at Morrison with eyes that had seen young airmen make mistakes for decades. "Son, you're young and you're doing a job that requires vigilance. You made an error in judgment, but your intent was to protect this facility and honor real veterans. That intent is right even if your execution was wrong. What's important is that you learn from this experience. Real veterans come in all shapes, sizes, and ages. We don't all wear our medals or broadcast our service. Many of us prefer to blend in and live normal lives rather than defining ourselves by what we did decades ago." He gestured to his simple clothes and faded cap. "I dress for comfort, not to impress security guards. My service was 50 years ago, and while I'm proud of it, I don't need external validation. The license plates and special ID are practical benefits that make certain aspects of life easier, but they're not who I am as a person. When you see elderly veterans in the future, remember that they might have done things and seen things that shaped the military you're now serving in. Treat them with respect until they prove they don't deserve it, not the other way around." Morrison escorted Colonel Harrison to the auditorium where 50 Air Force Academy cadets waited to hear about combat aviation history. He stood at the back of the room and listened as Harrison shared stories about flying over North Vietnam, about losing fellow pilots to enemy fire, about the fear and courage that defined combat operations, and about the traditions and values that had guided Air Force fighter pilots for generations. The cadets sat in absolute silence, captivated by first-hand accounts from someone who had lived through events they had only read about in history books. After the presentation, several cadets approached Harrison with questions and requests to take photographs. Morrison watched as the elderly colonel patiently answered every question, offered encouragement to young officers about to enter flight training, and shared wisdom earned through decades of service and combat experience. One cadet asked about the Medal of Honor, and Harrison spoke humbly about that day in 1968, emphasizing that he had simply done what any fighter pilot would do for their wingmen and that the real heroes were the rescue crews who flew into hostile fire to save downed pilots. Over the following weeks, Morrison's perspective on veterans and military service underwent a significant transformation. Colonel Chen required him to research Medal of Honor recipients and read their citations, learning about the diverse backgrounds and appearances of American heroes. He learned that combat veterans often looked nothing like the dramatic portrayals in movies and video games, that the most decorated service members were frequently the most humble and understated, and that age and appearance were completely unreliable indicators of a person's service and sacrifice. The story of what happened spread through the Wright Patterson Air Force Base community. Colonel Harrison's gracious response to Morrison's error became an example of professional dignity and understanding, while Morrison's mistake became a teaching point used in training new security personnel about the importance of proper credential verification and respectful treatment of all visitors. The incident was incorporated into the base security training program as a case study about avoiding assumptions based on appearance and following proper procedures for credential verification. Several months later, when Colonel Harrison returned to speak at another museum event, Morrison personally greeted him at the entrance with professional respect and genuine appreciation for the learning experience. He had developed a new understanding of military history and the people who had created it through their service and sacrifice. And Colonel Robert "Viper" Harrison, though briefly mistaken for a fraud by a young airman who lacked experience and context, continued his visits to Air Force facilities and his educational presentations to new generations of airmen, sharing the lessons learned in combat over North Vietnam and proving once again that true heroes are defined by their actions and character rather than their appearance or need for recognition. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments about a time when you learned not to judge military veterans by their appearance. Subscribe to Hidden Legends for more stories proving that real heroes often look like ordinary people until you learn their story.